Assalamu alaikum. Shalom aleichem. I always point out how similar it sounds. And it's really, thank you, Deanna. It's good to be here with you. I mean, we follow each other on Twitter, and I'm a big admirer of your work. Deanna represents as hard as anyone, and so does Rania, who you're about to hear from. Rania is like a general in my own little private army. She is like first-class warrior, and it's an honor to be here with Jamal. I don't know what you were just saying, but I've watched translations of your videos before, and I'm sure we'll get to talk afterwards, and maybe I'll get a summary. We all understand the language that Israeli propagandists speak. We hear it constantly. It's the background noise of the way that Israel-Palestine is covered in the U.S. You notice how I said Israel-Palestine. Well, what you usually hear is Israel and Palestine, as if they're two distinct entities, but nobody in this room can come up here with a piece of paper of this size and draw for me where Israel is. If you can, I'll give you $100. If anyone can draw for me Israel, because Israel has no internationally recognized borders. And I don't know where Palestine is either. But we know where Israel starts. We just don't know where it ends. We feel it every day through our media, through our mainstream media. We feel it through Hasbara. Hasbara is Israeli propaganda. It really means in Hebrew to explain, and it is the duty of every Israeli citizen to explain their position in the world. And Netanyahu and his government, which are encouraging American Jews to be like Jonathan Pollard instead of to be like American Jews, wants us to deliver propaganda. It was something I was encouraged to do just growing up as a Jew in America. And for some reason I didn't want to do it because I don't like apartheid, and I just, genocide turns me off. That's why I was happy to be here on Thanksgiving. So, you happy to be here? I mean, my family's in Winnetka right now having a little shindig, but I had to come here and get some things off my chest. Hasbara relies on, it doesn't rely on facts, it relies on emotions. And it's for export only. It's for Americans. It's for people in the West. And it achieves its success through the racist and Islamophobic common sense that prevails in this country. And it reinforces that common sense after events like the Paris attacks by attempting to link Palestinians to Islamic violent extremism, even though Palestinians are actually trapped, as I'll explain towards the end, between two violent religious extremist movements, ISIL and JSIL, the Jewish state in Israel and the Levant. They're caught between a rock and a hard place. And Hasbara relies on some very cheap but very successful talking points that we've all heard before. One of them is they only understand force. All of these talking points, they only understand force. Human shields, they teach their children to hate, they want to throw Israel into the sea, are projections. They're projections of what Israel and the Zionist project is actually doing to Palestinians. So they only understand force. Well, can anyone name any concession that the state of Israel ever made to Palestinians that wasn't made because of force? Why was Gush Katif pulled out of the Gaza Strip? Was it pulled out because the Al-Qassam brigades were throwing flowers and candy at the Israeli settlers who required 35,000 active duty soldiers in the Gaza Strip at any one time just to protect these 9,000 religious fanatics who were implanted there in settlements? No. Why did Israel pull out of southern Lebanon? Was it because Hezbollah formed a welcoming committee and provided them with gifts and za'atar and hummus? I know hummus is an Israeli invention, but they stole the hummus and then gave it to the Israelis. No, it was because Hezbollah acquired Coronet armor-piercing missiles through Syria and Iran from the Russians, which were able to take out Israeli tank columns. And I think that Israel would be on the Litani River today if it weren't for that. These are just facts, but we don't talk about facts in Hasbara. We talk about emotional appeals based on the racist common sense that prevails in this country. That Palestinians use human shields in the Gaza Strip, and that's why Israel killed 551 Palestinian children in 51 days in the Gaza Strip in 2014. That's why Israel destroyed 18,000 homes in the Gaza Strip. That's why, according to Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, Israel destroyed 89 families, killed most or all members of 89 families because Palestinians are launching their children into Israeli missiles. Which just happened to be, getting lost in the Gaza Strip. I got lost. I was just on a birthright trip, and I just happened to find this family. That's the way that it's portrayed. In fact, a New York Times headline after the Fun Times Beach Cafe massacre, when 9 young men were massacred in the Gaza Strip on a beach watching the World Cup, was "Missile finds Palestinians" at a beach cafe. It just found them. It didn't kill them. It's always portrayed in the passive voice. Who uses human shields? By the Israeli logic, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip mix their armed, what I would call resistance forces, among civilians. Who does that? In Tel Aviv, the headquarters of the Israeli army, HaKiryah, is in the center of Tel Aviv, in North Tel Aviv. I've been around it many times. Top generals, members of the Shin Bet, are eating in cafes in uniform right next to this defense ministry headquarters. There's a shopping mall right next door. By Israeli logic, Tel Aviv is a gigantic human shield for the defense ministry. Israeli soldiers are conscripts. They're conscripted at age 18. Speaking of teaching children to hate, they're brought through years and years of pre-military programs in which Palestinians are dehumanized, in which Palestine is erased as an actual entity in Israeli history and geography textbooks, as the Israeli sociologist Nurit Peled El-Hanan has demonstrated in her excellent work. And they go from civilian to armed soldier seamlessly, from street clothes to the army base, to across the wall, to raid a Palestinian village, back to the army base, and then back to go party at home but on the other side of the wall. By Israeli logic, that is human shielding. So all of these talking points are projections. They want to wipe Israel off the map. The Palestinians want to wipe Israel off the map. Well, as far as I know, there's only one nation in the Middle East that's been completely wiped off the map, and it's called Palestine. And when Jaffa, now known as Yafo, which has been incorporated into the Tel Aviv municipality, and despite having a substantial Palestinian population, is not allowed to represent itself on any Tel Aviv municipality logos with Arabic language. When Jaffa was ethnically cleansed, tens of thousands of Palestinians found themselves under Israeli artillery fire in 1948 and were literally thrown into the sea. Many died attempting to flee in boats to Lebanon, to Gaza, to Egypt. And now we find that in the Gaza Strip, a new perverse phenomenon is taking place. The brutal military junta of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is literally throwing the sea into Gaza. He is filling the tunnels that have provided the basics of life for the Gaza Strip with seawater. So the sea is being thrown into Palestinians, and meanwhile, the only productive industry left in the Gaza Strip, the fishing industry, well, having been out on a fishing boat with a fishing crew in the Gaza Strip, I can tell you that they're dying to be allowed to go into the sea. They're not even allowed to go into the sea. At least they're not allowed to go more than 3 miles at sea. And this is devastating, not only the fishing industry, but the thousands upon thousands of families that depend on them. Go to Shati Beach Camp and see what's happening there. You have thousands of men who want to work, who want to go out and fish, and they're just walking around like zombies. They can't do anything, and it's because of the Israeli siege. So I feel like we have to start turning these talking points on their head when we hear constantly about the Hamas Charter from 1988, which has very little relevance to the way that Hamas functions in the Gaza Strip. We can just quote back the Likud Charter, the charter of the dominant political party in Israel, which also happens to be the party that controls every single person between the river and the sea, because the Israeli government controls everyone. The government of Israel flatly rejects the establishment of a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. The entire Likud charter is a document of hate. We never hear about it at all in mainstream media. So it's very easy to turn these talking points on their head if we know the facts, but we have to, first of all, be willing to attack the moral exceptionalism that prevails around Israel, to do away with the moral exceptionalism. One thing that Rania and I did was to introduce the concept of JSIL as a hashtag on Twitter, the Jewish state and Israel in the Levant, to strip away the moral exceptionalism that holds that Israel's a normal democratic state surrounded by these fearsome enemies. And then I was called a lunatic. We were called lunatics until we actually started defending the concept of JSIL. Well, it calls itself the Jewish state in Israel, and it occupies large parts of the Levant, including Syria. They always say, why don't you just go talk about Syria? Well, why don't you stop occupying Syria? I don't see any difference between Jihadi John beheading people on camera with a knife and the Israeli military beheading children and innocent people with drones, with Hellfire missiles, with cluster bombs. And this is what I experienced when I was in the Gaza Strip, the sense that your life could be turned off at any minute with the push of a button by a drone jockey in an air-conditioned office tens of miles away in the Negev desert in the Nakab. Why is that any different? Because they're pushing buttons, they're in an air-conditioned office, than a guy with a mask on and a blade. Who relies on foreign fighters? Well, the Islamic State is recruiting foreign fighters through centers of radicalization, and so is the Jewish state. I could go to the Jewish state right now. In fact, there are programs that were active in my community where I grew up to send me there, and I could put on an army uniform and become a lone soldier in one of the brutal sectarian militia brigades like the Kafir Brigade, which is currently terrorizing Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And there are centers of radicalization. They're genteel, they have a nice veneer, they're acceptable in our community. But in synagogues where I've prayed, where I've visited, young people have gotten up before the synagogue and raised money for the Friends of the IDF, the quote-unquote Israeli Defense Forces, which is, as we know, a brutal army of terror. How is that any different than raising money for another violent extremist organization which is enforcing the imperatives of an ethnically and religiously exclusive state? The Jewish state in Israel and the Levant established itself through ethnic cleansing of religious groups that didn't fit. The Islamic State is doing the same thing with Christians, with Yazidis, with Shia, and with anyone who gets in its way. I don't see any difference there. Most disturbingly, the Islamic State and the Jewish state both seek a Christian-only Europe, free of Jews and Muslims. The attack in Paris was designed to polarize Europe and to actually increase pressure on Muslims to eliminate the gray zone, as the Islamic State's official journal, Dabiq, in February 2015, indicated. The gray zone is where Muslims coexist in Western societies, and the ultimate goal was to empower Islamophobic and fascist forces to the point when Muslims in the West have to take shelter in the Islamic State. The Jewish state did exactly the same thing with anti-Semitism. It benefited from anti-Semitism, and there were cases when it even sought to encourage anti-Semitism. Look at the Lavon affair in Egypt. And so to force Jews throughout the West, and even Jews in the Arab world, to take shelter in the Jewish state. And after the attack in France in January 2015 on a Jewish kosher supermarket in Paris, what did Netanyahu do? He didn't go out and call for the world to show solidarity with French Jews, to defend the right of French Jews to live where they are. He went to Paris and called for French Jews to leave, to come home to the one place in his mind that they belong, the Jewish state in Israel and the Levant. So the Jewish state and the Islamic State both rely on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in order to propel themselves forward and advance their very radical, destructive, and apocalyptic goals. And they're putting pressure on all of us. And that's why we have to join together against both of them. You can't challenge Islamophobia unless you challenge the imperatives, the sectarian imperatives of the Islamic State and other affiliated extremist groups which are active in Syria and in the region. And you can't challenge anti-Semitism without challenging the one major catalyst for anti-Semitism in the world today, which is Zionism, which benefits from anti-Semitism, which demands the proliferation of anti-Semitism in order to justify Israel as a sanctuary for Jews. And so we have to turn the propaganda completely on its head, penetrate and destroy the moral exceptionalism that surrounds Israel, and by doing so, we advance civil society here, and I think more Americans are recognizing that. They're hearing our arguments out. We need to take these arguments beyond this room and to advance them fearlessly, even if we're called lunatics. We're only being called lunatics because we are violating a common sense that is racist and Islamophobic and not based on facts or reality. Thanks a lot.